Hello, my name's Stephen. I'm a naturopath in Grand Junction, Colorado. The things that I'm going to talk about today come from pure experience plus an enormous amount of academia. One of the greatest things that I've found to be true is that few people really change when they see the light. They tend to change, though, when they feel the heat, and that is such a tragedy because of the lifestyle that can come to you from a correct diet and feeling good. There is incredible bondage when you don't take care of yourself. Health is a participating sport, and I would want you to understand that from what you're looking at is a dear friend of mine who at one time was a star athlete. Then he comes to college thinking of a pro athlete background, finished his degree in special education, and now you see him some 20 years later. This is a devastation because he ate like the kids ate. And what you see now is what he turned into. With that said, though, turning into a tipping point for him, which is something important for you because you need to understand where your tipping point is. He changed and he got an incredible background. Now all at once he's hiking with me in the mountains. It only took him a couple of years. The question is that I want to do for you is take you so that you do not have to get 2 years of experience before you change. This whole thing of health, in my case, what I would like to bring you to is a very simple solution. In simple thought, everyone needs a compass. A friend of mine once told me that if you have a compass and you know how to read it, you will never be lost. That's when I began my studies in terms of what does it take? What is my compass? And my compass boiled down to the blood. My heritage background is a little Hebrew, and so the word nefesh resonated with me, and it talks about the passion of the body is in the blood. So if every system in your body goes to maintain the blood is in an alkaline mode, that made sense to me. So my dining began to change, my eating habits began to change, and I became very disciplined about eating foods that would create an alkaline base as opposed to an acidic base. The simplicity of this is where there is acid, there is always fatigue and there is always disease. Converse, where there is alkalinity, there is always energy and there is no room for disease. And this body just absolutely takes very good care of the blood, and that in itself is where we want to go. So if we take the average American diet today, and what you're looking at is probably a description of an average weekly diet loaded with soda pop, loaded with prepared foods, and loaded with inorganic salt minerals. You need to understand some things. There is nothing in here that will give you energy. The most important thing that you can really understand is where there's energy, there is always health. And what we've done as a nation, as we've stolen this from you to make it a commerce business. And in doing so, you find yourself in a position where you're fatigued, where you're stressed out, you can't cope. And then on top of that, the next thing that you do is you find yourself doing some interesting things such as power drinks. They are not nutrients, they're stimulants. There is nothing in here that creates energy. It just stimulates the poor old cell to keep going. Look at the sugar that you could see in some of these things, and we don't need to talk about names or anything like this, but these particular drinks are loaded with sugar and loaded with caffeine. And from that, you're stimulated, but you're not really energized. We need to move past that and into areas that we want to discuss. Kind of an easy area is to set the stage for this is we eat things and then we deal with the end result of that. An Alzheimer's study came out by the University of Columbia, and in this study they used 50,000 people involved, and they were looking for the genetic code that caused Alzheimer's disease. And in the 50,000 people that was involved with it, they found only 3 things in common. Not the genetic cause of Alzheimer's disease. And by the way, that is such a devastating disease. It steals all your memories, all of the things that you've done in the past. And now suddenly people have that, and it is epidemic in this country. What they did find were 3 things in common. Inflammation. Where there's inflammation, there's always disease. Cholesterol. That's something that you can control by your eating habits. And then, of course, plaque. So the logic here would be simply, if I could control those 3 things, could I deal with Alzheimer's or dementia of so many other kinds? These studies began in 1992. A doctor by the name of Matisse Rath argued, in fact, in Europe, that it is not cholesterol that causes heart attacks, rather it is inflammation of the artery wall. So we need to look at reducing the environment the disease lives in, and if we can eliminate that, the next thing, perhaps disease won't live there. So the freedom that comes from the discipline of eating correctly is so important to you. Let's start off with really the hardcore concept of energy. It's called ADP, adenosine triphosphate. These things are, this element makes up 95% of the energy of the body, and it's made at the mitochondria. Now this flies right in the face of perhaps what you've heard, whereas minerals and vitamins and things of that nature produce energy. They're designed to heal and complement the cell. That's what minerals and vitamins do, in principle. ATP, though, is made for energy, and it is the most interesting concept. I want to walk you through a little things. Now, the numbers that we're going to talk about are so staggering. It caused me many, many, many months of study. Let's get into this thing just a little bit. The study of energy in the human body. It's called bioenergetics, and it's one of the particular reasons that we use this is to avoid disease and fatigue. That's what ATP does. We find the presence of ATP in your body, there's the absence of disease. That's one of the things that you need to kind of think about in terms of trading, and that's what we want to discuss, is trading some of the fatigued old bodies that you're looking at and building to live in the near future. We want to trade you out of that for a body that is full of life and full of energy and full of all those things that you really want to do. Let's talk about the heart for just a moment. This thing called ATP. There are only 700 milligrams of ATP in your heart at any one time. Now, because of the way it functions, we're going to get over into some turnover energy conversations so that you understand the complexity of this. But at 700 milligrams of ATP in your heart, there is enough at the heart rate of 60 beats a minute to run your heart for 10 seconds. That's a staggering number. So that means that this ATP story has to be duplicated. We have to begin to turn that energy over. Now, when you combine oxygen and nutrients, you get energy. That's the principal things that we really want to discuss. And at the mitochondrial wall, where all of this develops, it's kind of an interesting and staggering thought process that takes place. We have some elements that we're going to discuss in detail that build a little thing called nitric oxide, but they also build energy. There's a periphery of elements that's going to be discussed here in the next couple of minutes. But first of all, we do know now in science that carnitine, L-carnitine, is the only element that will bind to fat, take it to the mitochondrial wall, and convert it into ATP. Now, you need to follow me with this. ATP is adenosine triphosphate. What takes place that produces the energy is when that one phosphate molecule breaks off, and at that moment we produce energy. So the ATP goes to ADP, or adenosine diphosphate. This is so incredible. In that, the way this whole thing turns energy around again is we convert the ADP back into ATP. This is magnificent because that happens only at the mitochondria wall. And it happens 1 million times a second. The first thing that you need to come to grips with, we know that the mitochondria is the engine of the cell. Now the question is, how many mitochondria are there in a cell? And most of us would think, well, one engine is adequate to run one car. But in this case, there are up to 1,000 mitochondria in a common cell. In a heart cell, there are up to 5,000 mitochondria in that cell. So what you're talking about here is the ability to have 1 million times a second taking place to turn ADP back into ATP, and then that runs around in the cell and is converted to energy. 1 million times a second times upwards of 5,000 mitochondria is 5,000 million times a second in every heart cell that is taking place. That is such magnificent science. That talks about how complex we are as a human being. In hard numbers, that means a intake of 2,500 calories will convert to 400 pounds of ATP in a 24-hour period. And it's kind of the analogy that I want to give you here is kind of like, coming from my background as being raised on a farm, was we had a hot water heater, and I had 3 brothers and I was the youngest one, so of course I got the tail end of the hot water. And you have to wait until it's reclaimed. Every one of us that are maybe 50 years of age and older have dealt with no hot water. Now, when I was introduced to some of these new hot water heating systems, on-demand hot water heating systems, is the analogy that I'm going to give you about how ATP works. You know, when you talk about on-demand, the fuel that runs the burn, and as long as there's demand and that fuel is there, it converts hot water on demand for as long as you're in the shower. Now, I happen to like that. So if that analogy is true, that's what ATP does. On demand, it continues to make energy as long as you have the fuel. So I want to walk through a couple of the component parts of this. One is L-carnitine. Now we have some elements that we know are the only elements on the planet that will bind to fat, take it to the wall of the mitochondria, and in that conversion across the wall build ATP. Now, the interesting aspect of this is once it's on the inside of the wall of the cavity of the mitochondria, you can imagine the fire that's being built. 1 million times a second, this fire is firing, and so there is an enormous amount of free radical activity taking place. That's where we begin to talk about coenzyme Q10, because that's the extinguisher of the free radical activity. For just real quick purposes, free radical activity is damage that's done to the body. We all have to have it. Now, it's the CoQ10. So in this, for instance, as we begin to understand, you've got to have a volume of CoQ10. It can't be in minuscule amounts. So we want to put about 100 milligrams of CoQ10. That will function with every human being. Those are the studies that we know to be true. Along with this, when we begin to look at a couple of combinations of arginine. Arginine was a Nobel Prize winning subject in 1998. And in essence, what they found is it produced nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a very interesting element. When you were a young child, or you have children, the first word out of their mouth was no. Well, think about that today with NO nitric oxide. In this case, nitric oxide is a vasodilator. So if we're talking about not being able to move oxygen and nutrients into the heart and into the cells and things of that nature, then if we create nitric oxide, it causes the arteries to expand. So when that takes place, you drive down the blood pressure, because that's part of the game. Along with that, you move enormous amounts of oxygen and nutrients to the cell.